How far back are you going?
Well, we will go back as far as we can go back, and of course one of the questions is how far back does furry fandom go? The theory that I've developed after talking with a number of people is that the fandom itself starts around late 1983 or 1984. There were a number of individuals and individual publications that certainly go back a lot further than that. But there was not really the separate culture. Hi.
Hi, I'm here for the history class.
Yes, good. Yeah. In fact, I was just talking with Mel earlier today. Mel is doing a separate history of furry muck. So I hope to borrow very heavily on your information there, because up to now, one of the areas that I have not been in at all is the electronic furry fandom. And there's a lot of people who are virtually unknown outside of the electronic fandom.
How deeply do you intend to go into, say, way the heck back, about like a Pogo, and even earlier than that, say Buster Brown around the turn of the century, and even paintings that go back several hundred years featuring anthropomorphic characters?
We'll mention those. Of course, you can go back to the ancient Egyptians.
You can gloss over them.
Right, and point out that so that there always has been some sort of interest in anthropomorphics, even before there was a culture that was mainly interested in that. But it's probably about the I would say the time of Lewis Carroll on up that you got a serious interest in it, rather than just as a vehicle for social satire and what have you.
The growth of furry fandom as a popular culture probably mirrors the growth of mass media.
Right, so then you really get it started around the time of children's literature.
E.B. White's stories.
Yeah, those, and you can go back earlier than that. As I said, probably Lewis Carroll was the first one to make literary fantasy popular. And then, oh yeah, that was the 1920s. Again, you can go back a little bit earlier than that. There was a series of very popular children's books with a couple of bears.
That was the first.
First World War and a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
But there was one polar bear and one big brown bear, and then the Billy Goat's Gruff series, also pre-World War I. So you had the popularity with animal characters, even though a lot of them were specifically for children.
When does Beatrix Potter date from?
Late 90s or early 1900s. Yeah. And then for adults, I suppose the first popular anthropomorphics would be Crazy Cat in this country.
Pogo?
Pogo was late 40s and then mainly the 50s through the 70s.
Yeah, Mickey Mouse actually relates, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. But there was a very popular newspaper strip in England called Pip and Squeak about a dog and a cow, I think. I'm not entirely sure. Anyhow, a baby penguin, it was a penguin and a dog, and then the new character that was introduced was a baby rabbit. He sort of took over the popularity of the strip. And in the late 1920s, that was about as popular in England as, say, Rupert Bear or Paddington Bear are now.
Felix the Cat was the first anthropomorphic character ever to appear on television.
Yeah.
Because some RC engineers were doing a test, and they needed something that would actually not burn up under the hot lights required. This is about like 1923 maybe. And so they had a wooden statue of Felix the Cat, and they put him on a little wooden turntable and just let him turn a few times a minute while they did I think they were transmitting from the top of the, anyway, I forget where they're transmitting from, but...
one of the big New York
yes,
skyscrapers.
I can't remember exactly when they built what, but they said that they were able, and I can get you hard dates, figures, and all that.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I know about that, and about the first public screening was during the 1939 New York World's Fair, and I believe that was also a Felix figure. And the first animated cartoon that was done for television broadcast, again in the 1930s, and that was Willie the Worm by a cartoonist that later went on to do a bunch of funny animal comics for Fawcett. who I believe is still alive, Chad Groff.
Don't know.
Last I heard, he was in his 90s, but still in good health.
What about the Gertie the dinosaur? Was that the first animated cartoon ever?
It was not the first animated cartoon, the first one with a fairly prominent original character. That was 1912 or 1913, I think.
And
It's
did
just
that
when-
feature integrated human live actions with drawings?
yes, it was done as a part of a vaudeville act, and McKay himself got up on the stage as sort of the ringmaster who would stand beside the screen and put Gertie through her paces.
Oh, that's right. Like dance force, Gertie, or move your foot force.
Right, yeah, so it was part of the vaudeville act.
You could also go behind her because he had screen cut, so you could go back and forth.
Yeah, before Mickey, Disney had done the Oswald series, and Oswald was popular enough at the time, but that was the time when, aside from Felix, virtually none of these animated characters had much in the way of personality. They just, acted in a lively manner on the screen. They jumped up and down a lot, they ran around a lot.
And as he became a more sophisticated storyteller, you can see the evolution from Dippy Dog to Goofy.
Yeah.
Dippy Dog was a nothing character, and Horace Horsecollar would have probably actually done better. There were several of his other characters, and he was very remarkable. He was quite a phenomenon in that he and his group learned enough about storytelling to make series characters interesting. I don't think we ever saw a series character after that. Popeye was big, and then until the advent of Roadrunner, I never saw any megastar. They were minor stars, but nothing
Yeah.
big and lasting. Not like Coyote and Roadrunner.
Yeah.
Well, there's Bugs Bunny, of course.
Bugs Bunny, okay, Bugs Bunny, yes. How do I forget Bugs Bunny? The Chuck Jones gang,
Yeah, or the Warner Brothers gang, some of them were pre-Jones himself.
Yes.
But,
And Daffy Duck.
yeah.
All that crap.
Yeah. Actually, Daffy Duck went through a dramatic personality change between the time after Bob Clampett left and after Jones took over. Because under Clampett, Daffy more or less was one of these guys who jumped up and down, said woo-woo a lot, and was always playing practical jokes on people. After Clampett left and Jones took over, that was when he became the very cynical character. Anyhow, that was interesting. But yeah, again, all of these sort of built up a public following for anthropomorphic characters, but again, they didn't really create a social group like we have now. I would say that the social group probably got started around the mid-1960s or so, with a new generation coming up and watching it on television. In those days, you had a lot of cartoons animated cartoons on television. It was sort of a dumping ground for old cartoons, and they were showing a lot of cartoons on television that nowadays they won't admit that they show.
Oh, yeah, the War series.
Yes, right. Yeah, I remember a lot that are now coming up on these Laserdisc collections. For the first time, seen since it was shown on the theaters 50 years ago, never on television. I don't remember television.
Yeah.
But a lot of the kids who saw cartoons on TV in the late 50s and 60s, they saw these. They also saw some of the new cartoons coming around. Kimba the White Lion was very important, not just because he was a popular character, but because he raised a lot of the issues like if you have an animal society with both herbivores and carnivores, the carnivores have to eat animals. It's not that they want to be bad guys, but can you really ask them to starve to death just trying to prove that they're good guys? So this was a serious issue, and it impressed a lot of kids.
You really took the forefront based on those characters. When you started, did you start CFO?
Yeah. Not me personally. Me, Merlino, there were about 3 others that really got the club started.
And that, to me, more than all this animation, all which just attracted fans but no organizations, to me, that was the seminal part that actually started the fandom as an organization. Or was there an earlier organization? I don't think there was. There were some APAs.
Not really in the anime field. At the time that we started the Cartoon Fantasy Organization in Los Angeles, it was really a spin-off from the science fiction clubs, the LA Science Fantasy Society. The LA Club meets weekly, and it's sort of catch-all for just about any science fiction or fantasy-related group. A lot of them have their own separate meetings, but they sort of interface through the Loscas. You get your, back in the 60s and so on, there was Twilight Zone fandom and Star Trek fandom and a bunch of other stuff. And it was the mid-70s when they started showing the giant robot cartoons on the Japanese community channels out here. And also the first VCRs came out in 1975 and 76.
And when did you start CFO, and what's made you, why did you guys decide to start it?
Well, we decided to start it because we enjoyed seeing these cartoons a bit more than a lot of the other fans of the Loscas did. And so we wanted to show a program of Japanese animation and say, oh, maybe once every 3 or 4 months, fine, but other people have other interests and we can't show Japanese animation every week. And we sort of accepted that, so we said, okay, let's start our own club. And I was sort of the organizer, and Merlino was the guy who had the VCR. And we linked up with a couple of other people. One of them was a professional animator, Wendell Washer, who had gotten 3/4-inch industrial pneumatic tapes of a number of programs that hadn't been on TV. So that was how we started the anime fandom in Los Angeles, and then it grew from there. And it's a sort of strange thing. We didn't really realize it at the time, but I would say 70 to 80% of the people who became anime fans were also furry fans, although we didn't realize it then. Kimmel was one of our favorite programs, but we thought of it as more or less just another Japanese animated cartoon, although one that was particularly well done. And we also liked a lot of the American cartoons. When the Disney animated Robin Hood with the funny animal characters came out, and we all thought that was real great. But Disney had been doing anthropomorphic animals for a long time, and most of us, we were I'm thinking about Robert Crumb's Fritz the Cat, which we all liked a lot more in the comic book version than the movie version. During the later 70s, there were a number of independent comics coming out, Quack and No Guts, and a lot of one-shots. So we were interested in, of course, the Hero Pirates funnies.
It got so big that there were branches in other areas, and that's what surprised me.
CFO, yeah. Just before the club self-destructed, we had over 3 dozen branches, mostly around North America, but there was at least one in a Air Force base in Japan itself.
And you started some pretty notable publications, as I recall.
We had the club magazine, the Fantasy. It was Merlino who created Fanta, who was a funny animal character. We were trying to come up with a club mascot that did not appropriate anybody's copyrighted character, because we didn't want to risk having permission withdrawn from us if they found out about it. And we also wanted a character, just in case the brother decided to try animating its own thing, to go on to the club. So Merlino came up with his Fanta character, which is still the club emblem. And first off, fans outside of Los Angeles joined just to get the bulletin. And then we finally got enough fans in New York City that they wanted to start a chapter there, which we said, fine, sure, the more the merrier.
What was the time frame on this?
About 1980, now 79, 80. And then Chicago got one started, and we decided to reorganize the club so that instead of the Los Angeles club being basically the main organization, just splinters elsewhere, because most of these other branches were as active as the LA group was itself. We set up a sort of blanket general cartoon fantasy organization, and the LA group reorganized as just the Los Angeles chapter of the overall club. And we got other chapters in other cities, as I said, until there was over 3 dozen of them, and a number of individual fans around the country. And the original theory was that we were all going to be united through this one club and would have a big club magazine that would circulate all this information and so on. But club politics got started, and it was more a case of our chapter is better than your chapter, and finally we got a club officer who installed himself as president for life, and anybody who didn't agree with him was thrown out of the club. And he finally insulted a few characters publicly enough in print that they sued for defamation of character. And he abruptly decided that he was going to dissolve the entire club. And at that point, the LA group said, considering the way the club has been going for the last few years, that's fine with us. We will keep the name, which we started, and we will go back to being a low-key Los Angeles group only. So we just had the 20th anniversary of the LA club this last year. It's still going strong, and it also doubles unofficially as a monthly furry fan meeting in LA, because we still do have this overlap very much. But also during this time, a number of us sort of discovered this mutual interest in funny animal characters, and that was mainly thanks to Steve Galacci showing up at science fiction conventions with Irma Fellman paintings in the art show. This was about 4 or 5 years before he started Albedo. In fact, I think it was a lot of the feedback that he got from the fans that persuaded him to start Albedo. But certainly during the early 80s, one of the things that a lot of us looked forward to it going to a WorldCon or a WesterCon was getting together with Galacci and looking at his latest file folders full of pencil sketches for the comic that he hoped to do someday. And during this period, The Secret of Nim came out, the movie, and we were all very impressed with that. And now there was another app of it that started in the late 70s called Voodoo, which called itself the fanzine of the Funny Animal Liberation Front. But they were using funny animal as sort of a blanket term for anything that was not costume superheroes. So it had a few funny animals in it, but they also had a lot of general stuff. And also, it was more of a artist's app than one that was for general funny animal fandom. And if you couldn't draw it yourself, you couldn't get in it. I know, because I applied and they said you're not an artist. So, as a matter of fact, the way they put it, if you're not an artist, you're not a real funny animal fan. So, Voodoo eventually died, and one of its members was Mark Schurmeister, who had tried to keep it going, but after he decided he couldn't do it, he decided he would start his own app as a replacement for it, and he would invite in people who were genuinely interested in funny animals. And
This is the 80s, right?
this was the 80s. This was 84, early 84.
I remember all this going down. The late 80s was the explosion of the black and white market.
Yeah.
And
Now-
that's,
Right, but that got started by Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which was also 1984. That and Albedo were both 84, which is why I say that late 83, 84 was when the furry fandom really got started as a separate social group, and we began to realize, hey, we aren't just science fiction fans who happen to like more of animals, and we aren't just comic fans that happen to like funny animal comics. We're really a separate group that is interested in all of this stuff.
that's about the time that Red Shetland started and several other things, Ken Matroni. There was a number of pieces that, because printing was cheap and people were buying anything they could find in black and white for the investment value, and there was some drivel of it, oh, just horrible, that this was actually a publishing explosion. We had more fanzines. This was the time, wasn't this when the Bizarre Wars started?
Yeah,
Because
around
the
that.
Dallas Brawl started in the 90s, and that was after Bizarre War had died.
Right.
And Bar Wars, and then they split to, we were the waiting list for Bizarre Wars, and that was early 90s.
Yeah.
So that was the big publication. It goes to the cycle, and then comes the electronic thing there too.
Right, yeah, the electronic thing got started around 89 or 90. I think it was,
There he is,
okay.
That's true.
Okay, well, then I'll let you, but was it 89 at Drexel?
I'm going to backtrack a little bit so that we have a little bit of reference here. For those of you who aren't totally internet geeky types, there was created in the early 70s to start with, a dial-in BBS style system for people who wanted to play role-play based games similar to Dungeons and Dragons.
Matter of fact, I still run one, and so does Nikolai Shapiro. It's still up and going.
It was meant for people to effectively become a character that could interact with other characters. This was taken a step further with the invention of the internet and the ability to network computers together via stable connections into an internet-based system called a multi-user dungeon, or MUD for short. The MUD was actually the first attempt at people who wanted to deal with more than one person on a single system at a single time. And their concept of it was an object-oriented database that consisted of various types of objects like rooms, exits, objects, and players. The players went around trying to kill objects which were dressed up as monsters. And you went through these same Dungeons and Dragons hack and slash, get the experience points, gain the levels type of module that you would if you were sitting around at a table rolling dice and actually moving figures around.
Do you remember what some of the larger initial ones were? I remember Jabberwock out of MIT.
There was
What was before that?
Actually, the bigger ones were in Britain. The biggest one that I can think of, I'm trying to remember what its name was. It began with an A. No. Actually, yes, it was Abermud. Abermud was the largest UK one that they had available. Following that, some neat inventive boys at Carnegie Mellon University decided that they wanted to take this one step further. They wanted to go from as much a hack and slash point-based, status-based system and try to add a little bit more of a social aspect to it where the players interacting with one another more than just ganging up and beating up on some robotic monster. This founded what was first called TinyMud. TinyMud was called so because the first original database only had about maybe 15 rooms, and available spaces to run around in. It was literally tiny. It was started on a machine called daisy.cs.cmu.edu, and it was a very highly popular thing with the college crowd. Because it was started at a college, this is not too surprising, but they soon found that other college students, because they could use Telnet to go from one machine to another, would go to this MUD, log on, and all of a sudden you had this worldwide conglomeration of people coming into this one area to socialize. The hack and slash aspect started fading away from it. There were other MUDs that were still based upon live action roleplay, and they were called LP MUDs. But the Tiny MUD, which was then shortened to just MUD, then became the social interaction point. MUDs were still a relatively primitive concept. Objects were just sort of things there. There wasn't much interaction and there weren't much machinery behind it. To try and correct this, after roughly about, that's now 2 years of MUDs popping up over and getting progressively larger and larger and attempting to be more complex, but failing due to the primitiveness of the actual object system. Someone finally decided to take the code from the originality, break it apart, rebuild it, and include other functionalities such that machines could be built so that objects could act upon other objects, whether it be a player acting on an object, another object acting on an object, a room acting on an object, and so on. Because this was so changed, they tried to find a new name for it, but they wanted to keep the same look and feel of MUD. They decided, just as a joke, to call it a muck. There was no acronym involved with it. As much as people will try and constrain something to fit, it really wasn't the case.
They came and went like crazy.
Oh yeah. The biggest problem at this point was the fact that we had to constrain to the limits of the networking systems that we had available. Such things as they could only have so many players on at a time. Even though it was more than one, it was sufficiently less than the flocks of people trying to get on there. The maximum number was typically 63. It's actually because 64 and then one had to be reserved for the machine itself. And then everything else was used for players. this, because of its size and its constraints and such, mucks were created. They now had the complexity necessary so that they could at least have some fun building the machines and the operability of a more lifelike world. But they still had problems with connectivity. They had problems with trying to deal with the constraints of just how big an object could be. They invented things called properties so that you could actually do various things so that variables could be stored on an object, which was a big breakthrough. But there was still more need for development. This was where the machine, the server that was being referred to now comes into question, and I come into it. I was a college student at Carnegie Mellon University for 2 years, and during that time, I had started learning about MUDs, and I was quite fascinated by them. It was also at this time that I was learning that I was a furry. I'd always enjoyed, the big animal pictures and the unicorns on the wall and all the mythical creatures running around, but I didn't connect it with furrydom until I had actually read a piece of something called Perversion. I know, heck of an introduction.
I didn't do it.
But the fact of the matter was, it made me understand what a furry was and that I was a furry. I was an avid MUD player. The MUDs that were around there, some of them actually did have furry content. They didn't know it, they didn't understand it as such, they didn't even have a name for it, they just knew that they wanted to be animals that were running around like humans.
And then it's second.
Well, one of the larger ones that was based upon it that became sort of like the nexus point of MUDs was a world called Islandia. This was where a lot of the people had actually conglomerated together simply because they could find other people of the same likes. For example, the furry crowd. When Islandia was a MUD, incidentally, when Islandia, finally due to its size, was not able to be supported on the server anymore, the mucks came about, and mucks started to be put together. Several small ones had actually been built in that time. One of the more common ones being sort of the refugee camp for the Islandian people called Chaos. In this time, I actually had the rather nice pleasure of being able to administer a muck of my own. There was a small university, well, North Carolina State itself is not a small university, but their computer club was still relatively small. I had friends with the actual computer club, and they had a machine of their own in which they wanted to try playing with a muck. I thought, cool, this is great. Can I try? I'm like, yeah, sure. Our first attempt was to try and build a model of Disney World. You can imagine how daunting a task this was. Disney Muck, as it was tentatively called, unfortunately, due to the fact that we couldn't actually build everything, was later scrapped. When they decided that they were going to give up the project, they still had a muck server sitting around. I said, could I start that over again? At this point, I had already had the point where I had been in college, I had been dealing with the furry BBSs, I had been dealing with sending people email off and on because email was starting to become a neat thing to be able to send messages back and forth to people. And I saw two separate difficult problems. I saw Furry Fandom, really great ideas, really great concepts, they knew exactly what they wanted, but they were on systems where they had to go one at a time, very slowly back and forth. The ability to develop a really fast-paced, action-going type of plotline or story was crippled because of this. On the other side, we had the MUD crowd. Really fast-paced, they knew how to do things in real time, they knew how to think on their feet, play on their feet, but their biggest problem was lack of concepts. A lot of places were just, well, you can do whatever you want. No themes, it's not like this is going to be a realm of darkness, or this is going to be heaven, this is going to be hell, There's none of that. I decided to make a place that was specifically designed for furry animals, for anthropomorphics of any kind. This was what was called Furry Muck. A month into this is just getting up to the start of it.
And then.
Then we have 7 years of fun. Well, yes, it is. Well, fun is a relative term.
It was fun at the time.
Fun is a relative term. One of the things that I think is not well known is how this is evolving. We are the oldest month. We are the oldest month.
On the internet.
on the in the universe.
Well, the oldest and now the largest.
And the largest.
We have suppressed every other.
We are
That's it.
facing issues that nobody else is. Now, you don't hear about the CDA and other things like this simply because smaller mucks, you don't get this problem. Let me tell you, when we get 250 people online at one time, the weirdos crawl out of the woodwork.
We have 400 people at the same time running around this world with literally tens of thousands of rooms spread across an entire virtual landscape.
It's like watching the civilization of a land where you think an anarchy was a wonderful idea. An anarchy when your nearest neighbor is 20 miles away is just fine, and we don't care what he does with his dog in the privacy of his room. But an anarchy when you have a person next to you who is beating and killing their children, an anarchy is no longer workable. When you have an anarchy turning into the rule of a bully, and this I've seen on other mud systems, you gotta do something. So we have actually responded to this by developing, very controversially, some social issues and some other player issues. We are making history.
When FurryMuck started and people started to come in, and people started to really come in. You know, the snowball effect that happens when people find a good thing and they tell their friends, and they tell someone, and they tell someone. It evolved a community. It evolved a society. And then eventually it evolved a culture. I mean, there are language terms that people wonder about, like GIF. Things like MAV and FEEP. And words come out of the word that just because they are convenienced by these people who talk this specific language, we've caused this sort of our own little furry slice of furry that has been a net-based community that has started enveloping other things along with it. It's as much a part of furry fandom, it's still a subset of furry fandom.
In general, it's been a wonderful community. I mean, you don't have, you really couldn't ask for a better set of people.
Well, our biggest basis in fact is we didn't discriminate.
If I could bring in,
Yes.
actually, FurryMuck is almost a nice little microcosmic study of what furry fandom is in general. And like they said, they don't discriminate, but we don't either. And the largest amount of flack we're getting, mostly from our own members these days, is because we don't discriminate. They don't want to be associated with that group. They don't want anyone to think they're anywhere near this other group. And the thing we won't do at ConFURence is we will take everyone's suggestions for what we do at the convention. Okay? But besides what's legal in the law, we're not going to take many suggestions about who we can't have come to the convention or what they can't do there. We got a lot of flack because of that. It's like you were saying before, you have rules which develop, but I think it still bases on how much what you do affects somebody else.
It came up on Old Fan Furry recently about the changes and all the rules that had to be put in ConFURence. And somebody said, that's because back then, when ConFURence started, it was much smaller and with larger people. You've had to deal with greater issues.
I mean, we've had a lot of people say, well, we have to be so careful because what will the rest of the world think? I don't think that's all that important. This weekend is kind of a little bubble outside of the rest of the world, just like FurryMuck is. If furry ever became totally mainstream, like so many other things that are, I think we'd all kind of just go, I don't want to do that anymore.
We'd start something else.
Yeah, it doesn't become interesting anymore. It doesn't become fun.
Every group has its people that like being big frogs in small puddles, and the minute the puddle starts growing, they want to go elsewhere. Yeah, we lost a lot of anime fans once everybody started knowing about anime because it wasn't special anymore.
Also, I think when the group expands, you get people that are not always cultural. And people whose vision is very different than the originators. So you get the two groups. We got Group A and Group B.
You know, a lot of
This is why it's important to be able to grow and accept everybody rather than saying it should be just one thing.
well, the effect of the society and the culture is interesting because you have people coming in the beginning not really sure what's going on. Some of them get scared and go running for the hills. Others try to adopt. But even in the beginning, if you look at the history of Furry Monk early on, we had some early people, a few who were even wizards, who had trouble coping with the society because a lot of the people, let's face it, a lot of the people who are computer majors, who spend all their time on the computer before Furry Monk were probably playing interactive games, which aren't that interactive. And now suddenly that character you're talking to isn't part of the computer game, it's another person somewhere else in the world who's got feelings too.
It's an incredible.
So I don't think it's happened because we've got more people. We've ended up with just more people. And the more people you have, the more people who aren't going to quite be able to cope at first.
It's an incredible
Or not catch on.
When you start dealing with the I am one real person talking to another real person, even if there's a computer in between. The whole concept of actually internet social diseases, realistically speaking. The concept of causing the virtual real line.
It's already been diagnosed.
Yeah.
No.
Now, at the same time this was developing on the MUTs, it was also developing with the conventions, the social groups around the conferences every year, and all of the APAs that were starting, because APAs are clubs, they're social groups. And for a while, Razzle was about the only one, but then you started getting a lot of others, like the Furthest North Crew and Furry Press Network, the Brawl. Recently, Huzzah has grown from being just a fanzine to a social group and so on.
Now, I think it's rather interesting that this is probably one of the very few electronic societies that is actually bigger than. It's a combination of what we used to think of as the old science fiction fandom, and yet there's elements of things like ConFURence. Now, I know that on the bigger BBSs and the bigger services, there have been some get-togethers, but not with the growth and the faithful adherence of this group. It's extremely unique.
I think one of the reasons is I was wondering about why do the furries seem to own the web? We have the best pages and the best designers, and they're designing for free, and it's like for themselves, you know, kind of for an ego trip or whatever. And I think it's because on the computer you actually can be somebody else. In science fiction fandom, you could wear a costume to a convention, and you could get into live role play, or you could play a game by mail or something. But you couldn't interactively, one-on-one, turn into someone else. And you can do that on the computer. You can do that on Muck.
Are there aspects of this in any of these science fiction groups, the Babylon 5 group or the Star Trek group?
Not really.
And they don't group identify.
Anybody can watch Star Trek and say, I like this, I like that, right? But we're a tightly packed group. The only way you can get your furry fix is to get on a furry Mac.
And there's one other thing about Furry Fandom that should be noted here. Science fiction people have a universe that is handed to them.
Yeah, it's centered around the product.
When you say, I like Babylon 5, you are putting yourself with the mask of Babylon 5's universe over it. When you're a furry, you have no universe to start with. You create your universe as you go. There are places where you can have a furry wall template that just sort of goes thump.
There are enough
But
established.
realistically, you build your world as you go along. Your character fits into your world, not their world.
Develops his own angst. Several of them.
One of the nice things about Furry Muck is it really is a cross-dimensional like place, because you carry your world around with you when you're interacting with other characters and their world. And it's amazing some of the situations you get into, the relationships that form between these, beings from other dimensions, mythology, the future, whatever, alien worlds. And it really is like Finisher, and you know, it really is a multi-dimensional place.
Yeah, it's a world that exists because of mutual consent.
Yeah. That was the other thing that needs to be brought up. Everyone cooperates in Furry Fandom. Okay, not perfect. Everyone is willing to agree to a minimum level.
More or less.
I know what you're Where everyone says, okay, we believe that gravity works. Okay, we believe that if you get hit in the head with a brick, it will hurt. No.
Not if you're a tune.
But we agree.
They've had to create a world where they say, okay, we will agree to this set of rules.
One of the most well-known people who's been in science fiction fandom even longer than I have, who we deal with, is Richard Foss, who's our travel agent. And when I originally started speaking to him about ConFURence and ConFURence East, and split off from PhilCon originally, and DuckCon and all this, he's saying, this is incredible. All you different cons work together. That never happens in science fiction convention. And that's pretty much been the way, you know, at least the organizers of the conventions have always worked together. You know, certainly at the director level. You know, I'm in touch with the person who does all the Anthrocon. I'm in touch with Chris Knight and the committee members of DuckCon and Furry and plan that convention. Has always been that situation. And I think that one thing I have noticed in Furry Fandom though is you talk about the camaraderie. Pretty much you can go anywhere if you're traveling, and if there's a furry there, you know, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Now, when the fandom was a little younger, it got to the point where we had these massive excursions. People would go like all the way to the Bay Area for a convention, or come all the way down here, sometimes just for a weekend. And unfortunately, that isn't happening as much as it used to. I guess people got too busy, or what happened, I don't know.
It is still in Europe.
Well,
What?
It is still in Europe.
Oh, yes, I can imagine.
Yeah, get to the timeline.
But it's fun, and his hungry hunt show up at your doorstep unexpectedly. You can quickly uncover the shirt dress.
Oh, it's very interesting to hear talk about the history of Furry Fandom, because Europe, we are about at the same point as the American fandom was about 10 or maybe 12 years ago. We're just starting. Just last year we had the third annual European convention, and we had 60 guests. Now ain't that cute, but you see that we're just starting.
That's how big Zero was for us.
Yes, about.
64.
The only difference is that it's not a spin-off of another convention or room party, but that it's completely independent. There are no sci-fi or fantasy conventions similar to here in Europe, and it all came to Europe over the internet.
Well,
so we have a similar situation then with like with FurryMark here. But for Europe, the same. What was FurryMark for the American fandom is GIFnet, the IRC network. And yes, it's still the same thing happening. If there's a convention one year, if it's in Sweden or if it's in Germany, people come from all over the world simply for one weekend. We even have had registration from South Africa, or from Poland, from Finland, from New Zealand, yeah, from Estonia, from everywhere.
You have an accessible pool of experts. If some of you need to ask for advice on setting up ConFURence, you can get the best advice in the universe online, which wasn't possible with other fandoms. I mean, you'd have to call overseas, and maybe they'd be there, and maybe they'd want to talk to you at 2 a.m. Maybe not. I would.
Early science fiction fandom was a lot like this. In fact, when the world science fiction fandom got started in the late 1930s, the first couple of attempts to start other conventions in the early 1940s, a lot of the fans at that time said, no, we don't dare start any other conventions because that would undercut the World Science Fiction Convention. We must support the World Science Fiction Convention. It wasn't until about the late 40s when the science fiction fans started feeling that we are now large enough and have a solid enough base that we can afford to recognize other conventions. But still, at that time, the level of communication was so primitive. It was basically all by U.S. mail, because in those days, even a lot of people didn't have individual telephones.
And with this, the communication across the net, you can be in like Albany, Amsterdam, you can be in Albany, and your art show director can be in California. And it was not possible. I've worked on a couple of Worldcon bids 10 years ago, or 15, when it was in Austin, and trying to keep communications there going between the various chairs and departments. We had to put out a newsletter, and we newsletter editors spent all of our time expensively calling these people, and only 2 people could talk at the same time. Now online we can get history, advice, information, and we can do it in a group setting. This is completely unparalleled. And inexpensively, or relatively so.
I think you can draw a parallel, in fact, between the role that the mimeograph machine played in early science fiction fandom and the role that the internet has played in furry fandom. It's an enabling technology that has allowed the greater communication that has allowed really a group with a smaller focus.
It also raises problems, though. Because, for example, especially in Germany and in Europe, the internet is almost an all-male domain. So the European furry fandom, people who watch our conventions just say, "Are you guys all gay?"
I don't think that's such a problem.
No, actually, it's not. And but the point is. Because it's such an internet-based thing, there are almost no women. And,
certainly different in the United States.
Yeah, basically because the internet has been here longer.
Well, Australia also, there's a huge amount of women online in Australia, which was pointed out at Convex. So.
Eurofrance 3 had only one female guest, and that was someone's mother.
Who was forced to go.
I mean, I don't really mind, but on the other hand, I think it's a pity.
Well, I think it'll change simply as things
I hope
get
more.
going. Yeah. Well, I think the users that you're seeing as well. I mean, originally we used to anybody who was mucking would be some Unix expert, typing away on his monochrome monitor to get his fix of furry fandom. But nowadays, as computers are becoming easier to use, more and more people are getting connected. You're seeing a lot of people connecting from Windows 95, NT, etc., 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 where they can pop open a dead easy to use Mac program, type their lines, and get their fix of furry fandom.
Some of it too is the women coming into technical positions, because 10 years ago I could show up at the technical conventions, and I can promise you I was one of only 4 women there.
Folks, I
So now,
to butt in.
Oh,
There's a line.
yeah.